We're here for the Crossover Health Stress Management Workshop. My name is Josh White, and I'm a psychologist with Crossover Health. I have the privilege of being accompanied by my esteemed colleagues. I have Stacy Stocks over in Phoenix, Arizona, and Joanna Mung, also here in the Bay Area. But as you can hopefully see, we're all like many of you working from home today. So we're going to cover lots of stress and anxiety kind of topics today. Before we jump into things, I'd like to give a general kind of just disclaimer, essentially that this is for educational purposes only. Towards the end of the presentation, we'll actually go through some ways you could reach out to us. So some basic housekeeping before we kind of dive in. We're shooting for about a 45-ish minute webinar. And feel free to ask questions as we kind of go along. There is a Q&A function in the Zoom webinar format. Feel free to use that. And we'll do our best to keep everybody anonymous. When you put in a question, to remain anonymous, you have to put in the question anonymously. I believe it does automatically give your name unless you click that box just for your reference. And we'll try to answer them as they kind of go along, but there will be dedicated kind of time at the end. And as I already mentioned, this is being recorded for us or a resource in the future as well. Okay, so our learning objectives today is to really teach you guys kind of process-based steps for working with stress and anxiety. And the process base is really important because we don't just give answers, we give you techniques and processes, not just the end result, because of course we want to be less stressed. And so we need to learn some processes for that. And so we go down some very important keys, which is first awareness. We have to be aware of what's going on before we can intervene. And then we're going through some very common intervention strategies. So we're going to go through the body, we're going to go through the mind, and we're going to also attend to our values. And then at the end, we're going to hit an overall encompassing kind of lifestyle-based approach. So before we really dive into the meat, I want everybody to just take a minute and really ask yourselves why you're here today. Really, what are your goals? And I invite everybody, if you have handy, the old writing utensils, get a pen and paper, or if you like using a smartphone or tablet or something, really take notes. Write down what goals or interesting techniques or skills that one of us reviews today. They want you to think, what are you struggling with? Are there any particular stressors in your life that you're wanting to make better? Or what does better look like? What is that end goal? A very common therapy question we ask people is if we gave you a magic wand and you waved it, what would happen? Right? What would different and better be like? So not just stuck in our problems. So I really encourage everyone just take a moment and really think, what brings you here? What is something maybe you're struggling with? And maybe what does better look like? So I'm also going to weave in, a case example of kind of stress. So we made a fictional person, and we've called her Anna. And she is a fictional person who represents many common anxieties we see in our members. Stressors in her life include taking care of her family, 2 kids, and a partner who travels for work, as well as her elderly mother, all while managing stressful project management job in the technology industry. Anna demonstrates what we might call perfectionist tendencies and tends to think of worst case scenarios, so that she feels that she's not doing things well enough, and she fears that she'll be judged by others. Like many of us, when she comes to see somebody like us, she states her goal for therapy is to be happier and find a better work-life balance. And I'm using her as an example because these are very common things that we see in therapy and we see in life. And commonly in therapy, we help collaborate with someone like Anna to help her goals to reflect skills, like skills of happiness and skills of stress management, to help, and particularly to help her identify value-based goals that reflect in her new behaviors that we want. And we're going to use Anna as an example kind of throughout our presentation today. So if you can't think of your own things, don't worry, we have a case example for you. So we're going to start it off with awareness, and I'm going to pass it over to Joanna.
Thanks, Josh, for getting us started and kicking us off. As Josh mentioned, we'll start with awareness. So let's bring some awareness and understanding to what's happening to our bodies at a physiological or physical level when we are experiencing stress. So first things first is acknowledging, right, that our body is hardwired to react to stress in ways that are meant to protect us against aggressors or potential predators. Say, for example, you were on a hike and you were in Yosemite and a bear crossed in front of you. Well, in reaction to that, our body's automatic response would be to either flee, fight, or freeze in order to survive. This is also known as our body's stress response or our emergency reaction system. And it's there to keep us safe. It helps us to be alert for predators. It helps us to make our reflexes faster. It helps us to anticipate threat and prepare for them. When that stress response is on, it's releasing a surge of hormones inside of our body. That includes adrenaline and cortisol. And those hormones are responsible for many of the physical or physiological changes that we experience when we're in a state of stress. Things like muscle tension, rapid breathing, excessive sweating, or trembling. And as you can see here, it's also responsible for some of the emotional responses we might be aware of. And that includes increased irritability, anger, aggressiveness, anxiety, fear. The body stress response is typically self-limiting. That is, once that perceived threat has passed, once that bear in front of you is no longer there, the hormones in our body would turn back to baseline and we go back to our regular normal functioning. The body stress response is very effective and was crucial to our ancient ancestors, right, who always had to be alert for predators and potential aggressors. However, it hasn't quite adapted to how we experience stress in our normal modern day society, right? It's not every day that we're coming across bears or tigers or other predators in our day-to-day lives. More so, much of the stress that we experience could be attributed to situations or events that tax our resources or our ability to cope, right? And that could include things like constant demands at work, a challenging boss, managing a chronic illness or a difficult relationship with a loved one, etc. And this becomes somewhat problematic, right? Because these stressors aren't acute. They don't just go away. Many of the stressors that we experience in our modern day life are somewhat chronic, and they can be somewhat extreme. And as you can imagine, our body's stress response isn't meant to be on all the time. When it is on, this could be detrimental, and it can negatively impact our performance in addition to our physical and our mental health and well-being. Go to the next slide, please, Josh. All right, well, how do we differentiate between stress and anxiety? One thing to note is that stress has to do with our body's reaction to some sort of external cause, whereas anxiety is our body's reaction to stress. And it doesn't always have an external trigger. More so, it has to do with our mind's perception or anticipation of potential threat. Again, not related to a direct external cause, but could be due to our internal thoughts. And more often than not, the potential threat that we're feeling anxious about is quite imprecise and potentially unknown. Anxiety is that persistent, excessive dread or worry that doesn't go away. Even on the evenings or on the weekends, there might be no immediate threat in front of us, but we're still feeling anxious. And many of the signs and symptoms of anxiety and stress tend to kind of overlap, which is why we sometimes use these terms interchangeably. They do affect our bodies and our minds in very similar ways. For example, that rapid heartbeat, nausea, muscle tension, etc. But some of the hallmark features of anxiety is that it does affect us at a cognitive level, meaning that excessive worry, persistent worry that is hard to turn off. We might have a hard time concentrating or focusing. We might be experiencing what we call like brain fog. And it definitely does affect us at a behavioral level as well too. At the end of the day, we don't like anxiety. It doesn't feel comfortable. It's not a great feeling or sensation in our body. And it is very much part of our human behavioral tendency to avoid the things that don't feel good, right? And so, how does this manifest in our normal day to day life? Well, if I'm experiencing social anxiety, I might I might avoid social engagements, outings with people I don't know very well. If I'm experiencing anxiety about work, maybe I'm procrastinating, putting off assignments until the last minute. I'm avoiding talking to my boss or potential coworkers I might be having trouble with, etc. Now that we've kind of defined and talked about anxiety and stress in our bodies, let's talk a little bit more about what are some tools and strategies that we can use to manage the stress and anxiety when they do manifest. And I'll go ahead and kick it off to Stacy.
Thank you, Joanna. So just like Joanna said, just to piggyback on what Josh and Joanna said, so certainly now that we kind of understand a little bit more about stress and have some greater awareness of kind of what it is and kind of how we experience it in our bodies, I thought it might be helpful to maybe talk about some ways that we can learn how to effectively cope or kind of manage it, kind of through kind of body and mind. And so I also thought I saved a little bit of time for us to actually kind of practice one of these exercises. So we'll get a chance to talk a little about that in a moment. Uh, if you could change slides. Thank you, Josh. And so certainly kind of one of the most powerful ways that we have to kind of calm ourselves or our body in the moment is really through the use of our breath. And certainly we tend to refer to them as breathing skills. But really the goal here is to find a way to kind of slow down our breathing and elongate our breath. So taking kind of fuller, kind of deeper breaths. We refer to this oftentimes as maybe belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. But essentially kind of when we do this, it helps to move our body out of that physiological state of stress we were talking about, kind of that fight or flight response or the stress response, and helps to kind of activate our body's relaxation response. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this. If we could kind of move to the next slide, Josh. Thank you. So I did talk just really briefly about, belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. And what that looks like is really just kind of taking a breath kind of deep enough to activate our diaphragm. And what that might feel like in your body is that when you're breathing in, kind of the feeling that your belly or your diaphragm may be expanding on the inhalation and then maybe kind of collapsing or kind of softening kind of on the exhalation. This is just another example really briefly of another type of breathing technique that we can do in the moment when we start to feel ourselves kind of stressed or overwhelmed. So this would be called triangle breath or triangle breathing. And as you can see, the idea would be to kind of maybe breathe in slowly and deeply over a count of maybe 4 on the inhalation, holding it for a count of 4, and then slowly and consistently kind of exhaling to a count of 4. And the idea is if we can do this kind of in a consistent kind of manner over the course of 3 to 5 minutes, that might be able to help kind of move our body, like I said, out of that kind of heightened state of arousal that we're in oftentimes when we're stressed or anxious, and kind of into a state that might feel a little bit more physiologically speaking kind of relaxed. Josh, if you could move to the next slide, please. That would be great. And so what I wanted to also kind of talk about are some other types of kind of in the moment, kind of body mind ways to be able to kind of in the moment be able to kind of help us kind of manage stress or anxiety. And mindfulness is a skill or a practice where we kind of allow ourselves to observe what we may be experiencing, kind of our thoughts in the present moment, any emotional reactions we may be having in the present moment, as well as maybe any bodily sensations. And we allow ourselves just to kind of acknowledge or observe what we may be kind of experiencing just as it is, without maybe making a judgment about it or without kind of adding kind of any type of kind of categorization or, like I said, judgment about it. And the idea is that if we can do this, kind of focusing on our breath, what this kind of looks like is as we kind of focus on our breath, we allow ourselves to acknowledge and just be aware of what we might be thinking or feeling or kind of experiencing kind of in terms of physiological kind of reactions right in the moment. And inevitably, kind of our minds were built to wander. So inevitably, at some point in time, your mind may kind of wander off. And so in a mindfulness practice, the idea would be that when you become aware that your mind has wandered off, to very gently, quietly, kindly kind of bring it back to your breath. And again, the idea of maybe doing this over a course of maybe 3 to 4 minutes can oftentimes kind of leave people feeling maybe a little bit calmer, a little bit maybe more grounded. Sometimes people, when I work with members, sometimes they say I feel lighter or just a little bit more kind of recentered, right? So that's really kind of what mindfulness kind of is all about. And as much as it's really helpful maybe to talk about it, what I thought we might do is actually get a chance to experience it. So what I'm asking from you all is maybe just one, an open mind, and two, if you can kind of find yourself where you're able to maybe sit and be still for the next few minutes. I thought maybe we could do a mindfulness exercise, and then we can kind of, I'd love to hear maybe kind of your thoughts, reactions of how we feel kind of on the other side. So like I said, if you wouldn't mind just kind of sitting back, if it helps just to kind of close your eyes, you're welcome to do that. But maybe find yourself in a place where you can sit and be still for the next kind of couple minutes. All right. So as I mentioned, I have you start by getting maybe centered and start to focus your attention or your awareness on your breath. Maybe you've done this before. Maybe this is the first time. Either way, start to notice the gentle rising and falling of your breath in your chest and belly. There's no need to control your breathing in any way. Simply let the breath breathe itself. And if you feel comfortable, allow your eyes to close gently here. And then, after a few moments, imagine that you are sitting next to a small stream on a warm autumn day. As you gaze at that stream, you notice a number of large leaves of all shapes, colors, and sizes drifting along, each one at its own pace, one by one, in the slowing, moving current. Just allow yourself to simply be here for a moment, watching and noticing. When you're ready, gradually bring your awareness to what you are noticing going on inside of you. As you do, gently notice and label each experience that shows up. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, desires, and impulses. Pay attention to what's happening in your mind and body, and then label what's going on. Perhaps one of those thoughts here is, I don't have time for this. And that's okay. As the thoughts, feelings, sensations, desires, or impulses come along into your mind, notice them and then gently place them one by one on a large leaf passing by. Observe each leaf as it comes closer to you, and then watch it as it slowly moves away, drifting along as it carries the contents of your mind and body out of sight, downstream. And return gazing at the stream, waiting for the next leaf to float by. Continue placing each thought, feeling, memory, or impulse on its own large leaf, and watch each one as you let them just float away downstream. When you are ready, once again, widen your attentions to take in the sounds around you. And if it helps to follow my voice to bring you back to this time and this place, open your eyes and make the intention to bring gentle allowing and self-acceptance into the rest of your day. I was just kind of wondering kind of how that was for everybody. And if there's anyone that'd be willing to maybe share their experience, you're welcome to enter it in the chat, or if you would like to offer that. What was that like?
Well, I could say it was very relaxing on my end.
Thank you.
And noticing the thoughts of, I have to speak soon.
Very good. Okay. And for some of you, this might be something totally new, and this might have been a challenge to kind of sit through, and that's okay. Just know that this exercise is probably a little bit longer than what we would normally do for somebody that's kind of, generally, maybe practicing that concept of mindfulness the first time. But it's a nice example of a way to be able to kind of start to kind of apply kind of that sense of grounding in response to what we might be kind of experiencing again, maybe cognitively worry, kind of feeling some of those physiological kind of signs and symptoms of stress or anxiety or any of kind of that worry or emotional reactions that we feel when we're anxious. All right.
Yeah, so people put some comments in. Someone pointed out that it felt like their heartbeat was in sync with the leaves. That's a nice image.
That's a great image.
Yeah, someone else noted that, yeah, it could be a little uncomfortable kind of to start, but yet, so kind of once they kind of got into it, finding it peaceful and grounding. And yeah, and someone else pointed, this person points out a very important thing, that sometimes it's hard to see the feelings floating away on the leaves, that some of them want to kind of float a different direction or stay with us. And that's to that person, that's a really common experience. I have that experience all the time if I'm struggling with something.
And certainly a lot of times with the members that I work with, we introduce kind of mindfulness, and sometimes just sitting and focusing on your breath for as little as 1 minute could be just as powerful and effective, right? So this is something that's just one example of one way to practice this, right? So, but really great feedback. I'm glad that you found it helpful for those of you that were able to share that. Josh, I wonder if we could maybe go to the next slide. And actually, I'm going to hand it over to Josh. In addition to some in the moment kind of body mind techniques, we're going to learn a little bit more about some mental strategies that are really helpful and useful in kind of managing stress and anxiety.
Great. Again, thanks for that wonderful meditation. I need to put your voice on my smartphone as a good reminder. So I'm going to cover now mental strategies, really like kind of more just in the mind, like or things that we like to kind of teach people, and particularly we want to understand a little bit about the mind, and particularly this concept of what we call psychological flexibility. So to even just begin talking about kind of mental strategies, it's important to really just define what the mind is. And I'm going to attempt to sum up entire books, entire fields of thought, and very shortly. So it is a very difficult task. This is a lot of different theories, a lot of different competing philosophies and neuropsych things here and there. But I find some simplicity sometimes, the Occam's razor of some of this. I find two important principles are very important for understanding the mind or mental activity. One is that we are rule followers. Throughout your life, you learned a whole bunch of rules, whether that's explicit, that's what's more in attention, or implicit, those things that you maybe observed throughout your life, like, oh, people like this, so I should respond happy to that. People don't like this, I should respond maybe with a different aversive emotion to that. So we have these complex codings. I like to describe it to some people as software. We have all of this, both implicit, those not in awareness, and explicit in awareness. But not only do we have these rules, we also have a complex set of stories. Our minds love stories, right? I mean, just look at our fascination with media, right? If a story doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end, we're always left like, oh, something's missing. Like we like resolve. And we often try to do that in stories. We actually call this metacognition, and fancily that we like to try to describe why people are doing the things that they do, and usually we have no idea. So even in ourselves, we like to describe our successes or our failures. We try to fit it into a framework, and sometimes that could be helpful, but sometimes that could be unhelpful. So a simple way to describe stress from this mental framework is that stress occurs when our stories or our rules don't really fit the situation. A really simple example is I grew up here in America, and if I'm crossing the street, I tend to look left. Now, if I follow that same rule when I went to London, something bad might happen. Quite famously, when Winston Churchill came to America, he almost got killed. So that's the inverse of my story. But the point is, we need to be aware of our rules so we could change them. That's really at the basis of what the concept of psychological flexibility. And a key skill that we're going to cover here today is what we call diffusion. It's just one type of skill that helps us be more flexible with our thoughts. So fusion is describing when our thoughts basically become all of us. The metaphor that we like to use is if your thoughts were your hand in front of your eyes, that's all you can see. And our goal is, by acknowledging our thoughts, creating room, seeing them go on a leaf down the stream, we're starting to create some distance. So we could acknowledge that my thoughts here still exist, but I have so many other things in my field of vision. I have so many other things. I'm just not that thought, but I have all these other things. Because often when we overly identify with our thoughts, it feels true. It is reality. And it's very serious. Like, it's this very serious rule. And something that's very serious is hard to question. And it's very automatic. We don't even question it. It just happens. So what we try to do from that more diffused state of mind, as I said, we're recognizing, hey, I'm more than just this thought. And then actually maybe some thoughts aren't helpful. Like I said, those rules might not necessarily apply. The way that I treat my wife might not be the exact same way that I treat my child. I have different set of rules, and that's okay. That's flexible. And when we can practice diffusing, we sometimes have the experience of taking our thoughts more lightly. And then when we have more room, when we realize all the other things, we could start to look at those and be like, hey, what's actually important to me rather than just this rule? What values are in my life? So that's what we're attempting to do. And there's a million techniques of how to do that. And I actually find it's a very personalized approach. That's why I really enjoy my job as a therapist, to help personalize these things for people, because some of these recommendations that I'm about to go over might not fit for you. That's why we have so many different ways to do this. So I'm going to cover some different perspectives on diffusion. First is imaginal or visual techniques. So you guys just did one. Actually, meditation is a form of diffusion when done how Stacy guided us earlier, where we were visualizing our thoughts. We were watching them. We were diffusing from that. So for a lot of people, maybe that natural scene isn't your scene. Maybe it's a marquee of, but finding a way just to be able to visualize your thoughts And that can be very helpful because then we can start to add that distance. So that could be a helpful skill. Another full kind of skill is linguistic distancing, meaning we're adding words to distance ourselves from that thought. Instead of defining it as reality, we might say a negative thought is my brain saying something, a part of me is saying something, or I have a pattern that says something. So it's not so much identifying that this rule or thought is everything. Another set of techniques is under what I kind of call the naming, observing our rules and stories. So this sometimes comes for people at maybe a later stage, once they realize there's a lot of patterns to maybe some of their thoughts, be like, oh, there's that critical me, like giving a name to kind of that side of us, right? There's that judgmental side of me. Or, I even like to joke with members that I work with of give them names like, oh, here's Fred. Fred says things like this. I don't always need to listen to Fred. As silly as that can sound, like be very helpful to really kind of understand that I am not just this voice, this thought. Then there's a whole set of what we call disarming techniques, which is working with how the voices are in our heads. So really changing how it is said. So this can be through singing or silly voices, kind of doing accents. Because a lot of the times, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times when we're following rules, when that rule is stressful, like I must be there at 12 noon, sometimes we don't even notice that how commanding that voice can be. Sometimes we just want to work with kind of that cadence to the voice. And I would argue that everybody knows how to do this because it is a human quality to speak to a child differently. And not saying that we need to be childlike, but that we have the capacity to alter our voice. And that actually changes how we encode it. This is what the great actors and actresses know, that it's how you say it is everything. And that is really important, very true to our own thoughts. So I'm going to show you kind of a process, like with Anna, of how we might work with somebody from this diffusion principles. So Anna was fused with a thought like, I will never be good enough. And this is often the stressful thought that a lot of us encounter in our lives at some point. But it's a really hard workable thought because it's not very specific. I like to give the advice to a lot of the people that I work with. It's hard to change a general thing, but it's easy to change specific things. So a lot of times in a session, we'll try to make it a lot more specific. So here's a lot more specific of an example. If I do not prepare my family a home-cooked meal by 6 p.m., then my kids will not be healthy and we will not be together as a family. See, we're starting to name the rules and kind of the stories. So then we can practice diffusion techniques, like the leaves on the stream exercise. She could watch that go by, see if that helps. Then we can maybe identify different things like linguistic distancing or naming her story, noticing her critic. And then sometimes what I have people do is the silly kind of voices technique when they're really stuck with it, like really they can't get away from it. So for example, very often when we're doing kind of these silly voices, a lot of people are kind of nervous. So we always recommend people do the happy birthday song. Everybody knows that tune throughout the world. So it might sound something like this. My inner critic is judging me. My inner critic is judging me. You get the idea. And even then, my inner critic was judging me. And how was my singing voice? I think it was good enough. Then from there, once we practice those types of techniques, we're able to shift into more workable actions, right? Noticing that, my thoughts are telling me I should cook. And we could have some more flexibility, like, should I? Is it so important? And maybe it is. And then this is a really important pivot point. Sometimes that happens in therapy, where we recognize that sometimes that worry is trying to highlight something important. And we want to shift our focus to something that's important, like recognizing that, hey, Anna recognizes that family time is important to her. And so once we have that value, then we can shift into value-based goals. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Stacy.
Thanks, Josh. Josh, great job. So like Josh mentioned, certainly kind of throughout our workshop today, we've been kind of learning more about just kind of understanding the what, maybe understanding the how. And we really just kind of want to, this is kind of values and goal setting is kind of one way to think about it is kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? When we talk about kind of making change, what does that change look like? And maybe most importantly, how do we do it in a way that is getting the results that we're looking for, and how do we make that sustainable over time? So Josh, if you could, next slide, please. When we talk about setting goals, there's a really strong relationship. And again, Josh had mentioned a lot about this, that when we can start to identify kind of how much our values play a part in driving kind of what we think, how we feel, but also kind of what we do. When we talk about setting goals, we can look to do that and set goals kind of with keeping kind of our values kind of in mind. And essentially, kind of when we do kind of commit to action, we're more likely to see the changes that we're looking for when we kind of start to engage or behave in ways that sort of match what we value. And so there's a little kind of handy dandy acronym that we as clinicians or as therapists kind of like to use when we kind of introduce this idea of kind of goal setting. And I'm going to share it with you today. So as you can see it right there on the screen, when we talk about setting goals, we want to kind of keep a few things in mind. And so first, kind of the acronym is SMART. And so kind of starting with the S, right? We want to make sure that the goals that we are setting, one and first and foremost, that they're specific, right? We also want to look to see that the goals that we're setting, do they actually match kind of what we value? It wouldn't make sense to, start to make behavior changes in areas in our lives that we don't see value in, right? It's hard for us to see the kind of changes we'd be looking for if that would be the case. We want to maybe ask ourselves and kind of look at, is the goals that we're looking to set or the changes we're looking to make, are they adaptive? Meaning, do they improve or enhance the quality of our lives, which is what most of us are after, right? We also want to ask, are they realistic? So when we're setting goals, we want to make sure that we're setting goals that are in fact realistic. Do we have kind of what we need in order to ensure success, time, resources, things like that? And then finally, we want to make sure that when we're setting goals or we're looking to kind of make behavior changes, that when we initiate that behavior change or we commit to action, which is all the above, we want to set really specific timeframes of kind of what we're going to do. And we're going to actually next slide, Josh, if you wouldn't mind, maybe kind of discuss a little bit more about Anna and maybe kind of some of the goals that she set while she was kind of working with her therapist. And so one of the things that Anna had talked about is really wanting to kind of seek balance between kind of her work and professional life. And so some of her SMART goals would be, she committed to maybe spending 1 or 2 hours kind of connecting with her family kind of each night over the course of 2 weeks. She also talked about how she wanted to improve how she copes with stress. And so she talked about maybe kind of practicing one of those grounding techniques that we had kind of talked about, kind of 1 to 2 minutes, maybe every other day for the course of 2 weeks, and then be able to look back and see kind of what that does to her stress level, right? And then finally, she wanted to find ways simply to feel happier. And so one of the ways that we did that, especially once she was able to kind of use some of that diffusion technique Josh had mentioned, is to be able to identify and practice kind of saying one positive self-statement about herself to herself each day, again, for the course of kind of 2 weeks. And so really kind of the takeaway here, and part of what made these goals successful for Anna, is that her goals were in fact specific, right? They did in fact reflect what she values. They helped to improve the quality of her life. Again, she had the tools that she had to be able to kind of make these changes, and she was able to set goals and had the resources that she needed to be able to see success in doing that. And finally, she made them time specific. And so when we kind of talk about kind of making change, we want to consider our values, but also kind of look at using kind of this SMART acronym to be able to kind of create or set some really healthy goals for in initiating behavior change. Next slide, Josh.
Thanks so much, Stacy.
You're welcome.
So, in today's presentation, I feel like we're we've got a lot of different tools. We got a lot of different techniques, cognitive, mind-body based, values-based action and goal setting. And really, I want you to imagine that we are identifying different tools that you can add into your toolkit, some of which will feel more useful or utilized than others. Lifestyle changes are one of those tools, right? And I want you to imagine these lifestyle recommendations as kind of like your life preserver. At the end of the day, life is stressful. There are different events or situational stressors that are perhaps out of our control. It's like the waves are rocky, we're in deep water. It's feeling kind of crazy. There's maybe like a storm, a brewing. And these stress management lifestyle skills are sort of like our life preservers. They help keep us afloat when life gets stressful, and we can go back to them time and time again. A very useful acronym for reminding yourself about these strategies, about these lifestyle strategies, is SEEDS. And that stands for social, education, exercise, diet, and sleep. And just like the seeds that you might plant in your actual day-to-day life, these seeds need fertilizer, water, they need attention, to bloom. We need to attend to our seeds regularly as much as possible. So the first seed, S, stands for social. There is such an importance in terms of maintaining and forming social connections. Like we know, the psychological research has been out there for decades and decades. Social support is one of the biggest buffers in terms of stress, depression, anxiety, et cetera. It really makes a difference in terms of our psychological well-being and functioning. And when work gets busy, it's really easy. Like we tend to maybe negate interacting with our social support group as much or as often. We might be saying no to social events. We might be discounting or avoiding like loved ones that we have in our lives. But it's critical, right, to maintaining our social connections to help improve our well-being. So make the time to connect with your friends. Maybe that means also like potentially joining a meetup or a volunteer group or a club in your community, finding a local organization that you want to be a part of. Socializing these days can also look like online socializing, right? So joining forums, social media can be a form of socializing, etc. Education. Learn new things, take classes, read books, listen to podcasts, challenge your brain in new ways. And learning about new topics helps us to not just build new connections in our brain, but it also helps boost our memory, our productivity. Not to mention that learning new things or partaking in like a hobby that's new for you helps us to just like feel accomplished, right? It helps us to feel good about ourselves, helps us to boost our mood. The next E stands for exercise. And I'm sure you've heard it before. We all have, right? Whether it be from our doctors or our therapists or our friends and family, like exercise is so integral in terms of our physical functioning and our mental health and our well-being. Boosts our mood, bursts our energy, definitely helps with our sleep as well. But for many of us, like running miles and marathons every week is not really doable, and that's okay, right? Like at the end of the day, I want you to figure out what type of exercise, what type of movement is doable for you in terms of your lifestyle and in terms of what you have available. So even if that just means like I take 10 minutes a couple of times a day to take a walk around the park or take a walk around the block. Maybe my form of movement is playing with my kids out in the backyard after a busy day of work. Maybe my movement is I pop on a YouTube video and I do some light stretching or follow some yoga, right? Do what works for you. Something is always better than nothing. And I often emphasize the doable, flexible approach as opposed to this like all or nothing approach. D stands for diet, right? So attending to your nutrition, trying to work on having a balanced diet as much as possible, drinking plenty of non-caffeinated fluids, as well as eating regularly fresh fruits, vegetables, etc. Small changes can help you to go a long way. And if you're experiencing any sort of challenges in terms of like your eating or your nutritional habits, do know that Crossover Health offers health coaching and dietitianal resources. And so that could help you to create some like personal guidance for making those habit changes if you'd like to. And then finally, that last S stands for sleep. So quality sleep, of course, is essential to living a balanced lifestyle. And not just about like getting enough sleep, but getting good quality sleep. We do this by practicing good sleep hygiene. So getting to bed roughly about the same time every night. I know sometimes we want to stay up a little bit later on the weekends, but it's nice to be able to try to go to sleep around the same time every night, just so that we can get our circadian rhythm in the right order. In addition to that, having a good wind down routine, right? Not just jumping from your computer to bed right away, because many of us work from home these days, but having at least half an hour to maybe an hour, right? Where we are engaging in different activities that's meant to help us to unwind, to relax, to put away the stress of the day. That could involve so many things. I take a nice warm shower or a bubble bath. I do my nighttime skin routine, do some light stretching, put on some aromatherapy, maybe some meditation, like leaves on a stream, right? Again, do what works for you. And one of my number one recommendations for sleep as well too, limit screen time, right? Again, we've heard this before, but as much as possible, at least 30 minutes to an hour before bed. Sometimes that means putting our devices away in like a different room where it's like charging in the kitchen overnight, so we're less tempted. Try to replace that habit with something like a book instead. All right. Well, that's that for sort of the strategies that we wanted to share, and just like moving on and wanting to give you, a little bit of an overview of what types of services that we have to offer. Maybe given this webinar today, you want to learn a little bit more about how to better manage stress and anxiety, or maybe there are different psychological concerns or issues that you're going through, and it'd be helpful to get a little bit more professional support, whether that's work stress, general stress, sleep issues, relationship concerns, parenting concerns, right? We have a mental health team that is well trained in evidence-based practices to meet all of these different needs and demands. So if you're interested in scheduling a mental health appointment and have access to Crossover Health medical services, you can log into your member account and schedule an appointment, or you can contact your Crossover Care navigator. Next slide, please. And then finally, if you just want to, in general, learn more about what types of services we provide, or maybe want to learn more about different psychoeducational programming that we have available, you can pop out your phone right now and just scan this handy QR code that we have available to learn more. Right. Well, that concludes our content, in terms of the presentation that we had today. We have some time for Q&A. And let's see if we have any questions that we can address here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joanna, for rounding us out there. Okay. Yeah, feel free to send any questions you might have over. There are some questions kind of throughout, and we answered some of them as we kind of went. And just one general thing for Crossover, we do have a Be Well website, which is a name where a lot of our content is. There's lots of content there on different topics, mental health and physical health and nutrition and things of that. So there's some content on there, and that this will be eventually put on there as well. But we're also doing another same one in next week at different times, so we can get more people. But yeah, any more questions, feel free to send them. As Joanna mentioned, you can, if you have access to Crossover services, you can reach out to our mental health team. And, all three of us are just examples of the high quality and mental health of where we really vet our people, and we're all fantastic. I love working with our team, and I feel like I learn something every day interacting with my fellow team members. I'd like to remind people, if you're putting in a question, it's easy to put it in as anonymous. So feel free. I always like to sometimes phrase it that sometimes, there's always so many questions we have for psychologists. This is your opportunity, whether it's about stress management or other issues. Well, someone says thank you. You're welcome. Mm-hmm. Okay. Would anyone like to take this question? Do you guys see it?
It's a very good question. Trying to discern
Sure,
the
the
best way to
question,
go about
yeah.
addressing that. You know, I do think when you're at a point in which the stress that you're experiencing is very seriously like impacting your day-to-day functioning and really like your ability to take care of yourself, right? And we're talking about, you know, to the degree that I am having trouble like eating regularly, bathing, grooming regularly. I'm having trouble with my sleep and just general well-being, right? We would say that it's certainly like impacting your functioning. I think in terms of figuring out whether or not it requires a medical leave, that is something that should be discussed, I think, in conjunction with a medical professional. So whether that's your primary care doctor, therapist, psychologist, whoever it is that you might be working with, they can do a more thorough assessment around how it might be impacting your functioning and to what degree, and provide some recommendations around medical leave or not. There might be alternatives to medical leave that are also more than good enough to help address your presenting concerns.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, when sometimes if we do decide that medical leave is important, it's not vacation. What our general recommendations, it's really creating a treatment plan to address those issues. So whether that's kind of continued therapy, like kind of those SMART goals that Stacey went through, if medical leave is kind of deemed to be appropriate, a lot of times we're giving very specific goals to kind of work on to get yourself back up to functioning, not just taking time off. That's right. Just like if you were on for medical leave for like an accident, a physical accident or something of that nature, right? There's that rehab in the same way, like we kind of give rehab type of recommendations. But I'd always recommend, you know, sometimes, yes, we do need some R&R.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's where we're trying to encourage people to, you know, use that vacation day to recharge. Those are very important.
By all means, this is not required, but I wondered if anyone had any just observations or just kind of comments about the presentation. If, welcome to put in the chat or the Q&A, whether it was maybe helpful or useful, if there's something that you maybe learned or thought about maybe differently given based on what we talked about today. We'd love to hear just any general comments about kind of what we presented and how we presented it today, if you're comfortable sharing that. Okay.
All right. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. Here's some more things. There will be, the recording will be put up eventually on Be Well. To answer that real quickly, someone mentions that they liked all the advice that they Buddhist, it reminds me of Buddhist meditation, and yeah, there's just speak to that just real quickly. Yeah, there's mindfulness is a tool kind of from the Buddhist tradition that we've utilized. A lot of mental health things. It's kind of the scientification of a lot of old practices. Scientification isn't a real word, but I think you understand the meaning there. And yeah, personally, I grew up Buddhist, so it's an important part for me.
Good. It looks like also somebody mentioned that this was really helpful, so that's good. And certainly if you found this to be helpful or useful and you have access or interest in learning more about crossover health, again, we have the QR code. We're also available, again, reach out to any your care navigator, any member of the mental health team, if you do have access to crossover health, and we'd be happy to assist and support, collaborate, all those good things.
All right. I'm going to close us out. Again, I want to thank my colleagues, Stacy and Joanna. It's such a pleasure, and we'll do it again next week. And thanks everybody for attending.